April 29, 1945, just outside Munich, Germany. A light rain fell on the dark green pines surrounding the small Bavarian town of Dachau as Staff Sergeant James Wilson of the 761st Tank Battalion stared through his binoculars at the distant compound. The weather matched his mood, grey, sombre, uncertain. SS guards along the perimeter fence had been taunting the approaching American forces for hours, shouting that colored boys could never defeat the master race. What those Nazi guards didn't know was that these black American soldiers had already proven themselves across France and Germany, and what they were about to discover inside those fences would transform their mission from mere military victory to profound moral reckoning. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What follows is not just a tale of liberation, but of how a group of men who had endured segregation and discrimination in their own country would come face to face with the ultimate consequences of racial hatred, and how that encounter would forever change both the liberated and their liberators. The morning had begun like many others for the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers. They had been in almost continuous combat since landing in France in October 1944, fighting their way across Europe as part of General Patton's Third Army. They had helped liberate towns in France, Belgium, and Germany, battling both enemy forces and the prejudices within their own military. The 761st was one of the few black combat units in a segregated U.S. Army, and they had spent the war proving their worth in battle after battle. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, a 26-year-old former sharecropper from Georgia, had been with the unit since its formation at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. He had seen the battalion lose good men across France and Germany, and he had personally destroyed 7 German tanks and numerous gun emplacements. His hands, calloused from years of cotton picking before the war, now bore the scars of loading shells into the 75mm cannon of his Sherman tank. His eyes, once wide with fear during their first engagements in France, were now narrowed with experienced determination as he surveyed the compound ahead. "Radio check all vehicles," Wilson said into his throat microphone. One by one, the 4 other tank commanders in his platoon responded. "Panther 2, check," came the voice of Sergeant Thomas Reynolds. "Panther 3, good to go," responded Corporal Marcus Johnson. "Panther 4, ready," said Sergeant William Morris. "Panther 5, standing by," finished Lieutenant Robert Jackson. As Wilson lowered his binoculars, he noticed Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commanding officer of the 761st, approaching his tank. Bates was one of the few white officers who had stayed with the battalion since its formation, fighting alongside his men and against the military bureaucracy that had initially doubted their capabilities. "Wilson, we've got new orders," Bates said, his voice grave. "We're being attached to the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions for a special operation. Intelligence reports indicate we're approaching a camp of some kind. It's called Dachau." "A POW camp, sir?" Wilson asked. Bates shook his head. "Intelligence isn't clear. But whatever it is, it's heavily guarded. The 45th will approach from the south, the 42nd from the east. We're supporting the 42nd's approach." "Yes, sir," Wilson replied, already calculating the best approach for his tanks through the forested terrain. As Bates walked away, Wilson's loader, Private First Class Marcus Davis, a 19-year-old from Harlem who had lied about his age to enlist, climbed up beside him. "What's the word, Sarge?" Davis asked, his young face showing the strain of months of combat. "We're moving out in 20 minutes, Wilson replied. "Get the men ready." In the nearby command tent of the 42nd Infantry Division, Major Richard Baldwin was briefing his officers on the approach to Dachau. The 42nd, known as the Rainbow Division for its diverse composition of National Guard units from across the United States, had been fighting its way through southern Germany for weeks. Baldwin, a 35-year-old former history professor from Connecticut, pointed to the large map spread across the table. "Latest reconnaissance shows guard towers here, here, and here," he said, marking the positions. "Machine gun emplacements along the perimeter fence. The 761st Tank Battalion will provide armored support for our approach." Captain David Cohen, a Jewish officer from New York, studied the map intently. "Any word on what type of facility this is, sir?" Baldwin's expression darkened. Intelligence reports are conflicting. Officially, it's listed as a work camp, but refugees we've encountered have said other things. What kind of things, sir? Asked Lieutenant Michael O'Connor. Reports of mass executions, starvation, medical experiments, Baldwin replied quietly. But we won't know for certain until we get there, and that's not our primary concern. Our orders are to secure the facility and neutralize any resistance. As the officers dispersed, Baldwin called Cohen back. David, I want you to coordinate with the 761st. They'll be supporting your company's approach to the main gate. Cohen nodded. Yes, sir. He hesitated, then asked, Do they know what they might find in there? Baldwin shook his head. No one does, Captain. Not really. Meanwhile, inside Dachau, SS Hauptsturmführer Johannes Schmidt paced the administrative office, issuing rapid-fire orders to his subordinates. At 40, Schmidt was a true believer in Nazi ideology, having joined the party in its early days. His immaculate uniform contrasted sharply with the gaunt, emaciated prisoners visible through his office window. Burn the remaining records, he ordered an adjutant, and speed up the disposal operations. Sir, the young officer replied hesitantly, there are too many. We can't process them all before the Americans arrive. Schmidt's face hardened. Then use the backup plan. Distribute weapons to all available personnel. We'll make a stand at the main gate. As the officer left, Schmidt turned to SS Untersturmführer Karl Weber, his second in command. What about the special prisoners in Block 26? Weber, a former Munich police officer who had risen through SS ranks, checked his clipboard. Eliminated this morning, sir, as ordered. Schmidt nodded approvingly. Good. Now about these American forces approaching. Our forward observers report they include Negro units. Weber allowed himself a small smile. The Americans send their Untermenschen against us. Perhaps they've already admitted defeat. Nevertheless, Schmidt replied, prepare the men. Full combat readiness. As the tanks of the 761st moved into position alongside the infantry of the 42nd Division, Captain Cohen approached Wilson's tank. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy mist hanging over the pine forest. Staff Sergeant Wilson? Cohen called up. Wilson looked down from his commander's hatch. Yes, sir. Captain David Cohen, Baker Company, 42nd Infantry. We'll be moving out in 10 minutes. Your platoon will provide cover for our advance to the main gate. Wilson nodded. Understood, sir, we're ready. Cohen hesitated, then added, Intelligence suggests we may encounter unusual conditions inside. Be prepared. What kind of conditions, sir? Wilson asked. Reports are unclear, Cohen admitted, but whatever we find, we need to maintain discipline. As Cohen walked away, Wilson turned to Davis, who had been listening to the exchange. What do you make of that, Davis? The young loader shrugged. Don't know, Sarge, but I got a bad feeling. Wilson nodded slowly. Yeah, me too. At 11:15 hours, the attack began. The tanks of the 761st moved forward, engines roaring as they broke through the tree line, the infantry of the 42nd Division advancing alongside them. From his position in the lead tank, Wilson could see the compound clearly now. A vast sprawling facility surrounded by electrified barbed wire fences, guard towers, and concrete bunkers. As they approached, German machine guns opened fire from the guard towers, the bullets pinging harmlessly off the Sherman tank's armor. Wilson swiveled his turret, acquiring the nearest tower in his sights. Gunner, he round guard tower at 2 o'clock, he ordered. On target, replied Corporal Henry Jenkins, the tank's gunner. Fire! The 75mm gun roared, its shell striking the base of the tower, which collapsed in a shower of concrete and wood. Along the line, the other tanks of the 761st engaged their targets, methodically destroying the camp's outer defenses. From a concrete bunker near the main gate, Schmidt watched through binoculars as the American forces approached. When he saw the distinctive olive-drab Sherman tanks with their white star markings, he turned to Weber. So it's true. They've sent Negro tank crews against us. Weber sneered. Perhaps we should surrender to these Schwartz now and save ourselves the trouble. The men around them laughed, but Schmidt's expression remained cold. Hold your positions. Let them approach the main gate. As Wilson's tank neared the entrance to the camp, he could see strange figures moving behind the fence, skeletal, dressed in striped uniforms, watching the approaching Americans with hollow eyes. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp spring weather. "Sarge," Davis said quietly, "what the hell is this place?" Before Wilson could answer, a white flag appeared from the guardhouse by the main gate. Wilson immediately radioed the information to Captain Cohen. "Hold position," Cohen ordered. "Infantry will move forward to accept surrender." Wilson watched as Cohen led a squad of infantrymen toward the gate, weapons ready. As they approached, an SS officer, Schmidt, stepped out, hands raised. "I wish to discuss terms of surrender," Schmidt called in accented English. Cohen approached cautiously. "There are no terms. Unconditional surrender only." Schmidt's eyes narrowed as he noted the Star of David pin discreetly attached to Cohen's uniform collar, a personal violation of regulations that many Jewish American soldiers risked. "A Jew," Schmidt said, his voice filled with contempt. "And you bring Negroes with you. How fitting that America sends its lowest to fight Germany's finest." Cohen's face remained impassive. "Your weapons, now." As the German guards began placing their weapons on the ground, Wilson noticed movement on the second floor of a nearby building. A flash of metal caught his eye. "Sniper!" he shouted, traversing his turret toward the threat. Gunfire erupted from several buildings. Captain Cohen fell, clutching his shoulder. The infantry squad dove for cover as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Schmidt used the confusion to duck back into the guardhouse. Wilson didn't hesitate. "Gunner, target that building, fire!" The Sherman's gun boomed, sending a high-explosive shell into the sniper's position. The other tanks joined in, systematically targeting the sources of German fire. The infantry of the 42nd surged forward, engaging in close-quarters combat with the SS guards who had broken the surrender. Within minutes, the fighting was over. Most of the SS guards had been killed or wounded, with only a few managing to surrender. Captain Cohen, his wound bandaged, approached Wilson's tank as the sergeant climbed down. "Good eye, Sergeant," Cohen said, extending his hand. "You saved my life." Wilson shook it firmly. "Just doing my job, sir." Cohen nodded toward the main gate, now secured by American troops. "We need to move in and secure the rest of the camp. Your tanks will support us." As they entered the main compound, the true nature of Dachau revealed itself. Thousands of emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms stood or lay in open areas and crowded barracks. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, disease, and death that made even battle-hardened soldiers gag. Wilson stopped in his tracks, staring in disbelief at the scene before him. Men who looked more like skeletons than human beings reached out with bony hands, some too weak to stand, others crying with joy at the sight of American uniforms. "My God," whispered Davis beside him. "What is this place?" A prisoner who spoke English approached them, his striped uniform hanging from his skeletal frame. "You are Americans? You have come to liberate us?" Wilson nodded, unable to find words. The prisoner looked at Wilson's dark skin, then at the other black soldiers of the 761st who were entering the camp. A smile broke across his gaunt face. "The Nazis told us America sends its Negro soldiers because they do not value them. Now we see the truth. America sends its finest men to free us." More prisoners gathered around the black soldiers, touching their uniforms, their equipment, their skin, as if to confirm they were real. Many wept openly. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others, too weak to move, simply raised skeletal arms in greeting from where they lay. Captain Cohen, his face ashen, approached Wilson. "We need to secure the remaining buildings. We don't know how many guards might still be hiding." Wilson nodded, turning to his men. "Davis, Johnson, with me. Reynolds, keep the tank here and coordinate with the infantry." As they moved deeper into the camp, the horrors multiplied. They discovered barracks designed to hold 200 men that contained over 500, with prisoners stacked 4 to a narrow bunk. The dead lay among the living, many too weak to move the bodies of their comrades. In one building, they found a room filled with thousands of pairs of shoes. In another, piles of human hair. And behind the crematorium, they discovered railway cars filled with hundreds of corpses, prisoners who had died during transport to the camp and never been unloaded. Wilson, who had seen the brutality of combat across France and Germany, found himself unable to comprehend the systematic cruelty evident at every turn. Davis, younger and less hardened, vomited repeatedly as they moved through the camp. Even the veteran infantrymen of the 42nd Division were shaken by what they encountered. In a secure office within the administration building, they found Schmidt sitting calmly at a desk, having changed from his SS uniform into civilian clothes. 2 American MPs stood guard over him. "Ah," Schmidt said as Wilson and Cohen entered. "The conquering heroes, a Jew and a Negro. How proud America must be." Cohen ignored him, focusing on the documents spread across the desk. "He was trying to destroy records when we found him. Translation teams are on the way." Wilson stared at Schmidt, trying to reconcile the ordinary-looking man before him with the monstrous evidence they had seen throughout the camp. "How many?" he asked simply. Schmidt raised an eyebrow. "How many what?" "How many people died here?" Schmidt shrugged indifferently. "Who keeps count of such things? They were not people. They were Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, political enemies, the dregs that needed to be cleared away for the new Germany." Wilson felt a cold rage building inside him, his hands clenched into fists. Cohen noticed and placed a restraining hand on his arm. "He'll face justice, Sergeant," Cohen said quietly. "They all will." Outside, medical teams from the 42nd Division's combat support units had begun treating the most critical cases among the survivors. Army rations were being distributed, though doctors warned that many prisoners were too malnourished to handle solid food. Evacuation of the sickest prisoners to field hospitals had begun, but there were thousands in need of immediate care. Wilson found Lieutenant Colonel Bates standing near the main gate, his usually composed face showing the strain of what they had discovered. "Sir," Wilson said, saluting. Bates returned the salute mechanically. "Wilson, how are your men holding up?" "They're doing their job, sir, but this—" Wilson gestured toward the camp. "I know," Bates said. "I've requested additional medical support and supplies. The 45th Division is securing the SS barracks outside the camp perimeter. They found—" He paused. "They found a train full of bodies, prisoners who never even made it into the camp." Wilson nodded, having seen the railway cars himself. "Sir, permission to have my men assist with food distribution. The prisoners are overwhelming the infantry units." "Granted," Bates replied. "But remind your men these people are severely malnourished. Small portions only, and primarily liquids. Follow the medic's guidance." As Wilson organized his tank crews to assist with relief efforts, he noticed a commotion near one of the barracks. A group of prisoners had surrounded an SS guard who had been discovered hiding among them, wearing a prisoner's uniform. The American infantrymen were struggling to restrain the prisoners, who were beating the guard with bare fists, wooden clogs, anything they could find. Wilson rushed over, pushing through the crowd. "Stop! Stop this now!" The prisoners, many of whom didn't speak English, continued their assault. Wilson physically placed himself between them and the bloodied guard, who cowered behind him. "We are not them!" Wilson shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We are not them!" Gradually, the frenzy subsided. A prisoner who spoke English translated Wilson's words. The crowd reluctantly backed away, allowing American MPs to take custody of the guard. As the situation calmed, an elderly prisoner approached Wilson. He wore the striped uniform like the others, but with a purple triangle sewn onto it, the Nazi designation for Jehovah's Witnesses. Despite his emaciated condition, the man carried himself with dignity. "Thank you," he said in halting English. "We must not become what they are." Wilson nodded, struck by the moral strength of a man who had endured unimaginable suffering, yet retained his humanity. "What's your name?" "I am Otto Müller," the man replied. "From Berlin. I have been here 4 years." "4 years?" Wilson repeated, incredulous. Müller nodded. "Before I was a teacher. When I refused to teach Nazi ideology or give the Hitler salute, they arrested me. When I would not renounce my faith or swear loyalty to Hitler, they sent me here." Wilson removed his canteen and offered it to Müller, who took a small, careful sip. "Mr. Müller, can you help us? We need people who speak both English and German to help organize the distribution of food and medical aid." Müller straightened, purpose returning to his hollow eyes. "Yes, I will help." With Müller's assistance, Wilson established a more orderly system for distributing rations and identifying prisoners in most urgent need of medical attention. Throughout the afternoon, the men of the 761st worked alongside infantry medics and the prisoners themselves to bring some measure of relief to the survivors. As dusk approached, Wilson found himself in one of the children's barracks, where a few dozen boys between the ages of 8 and 15 were housed. Unlike most of the adult prisoners, who had welcomed the Americans with weary joy, many of the children seemed wary, hiding in corners or watching with suspicious eyes. Wilson approached slowly, removing his helmet to appear less threatening. "It's okay," he said gently, knowing they probably didn't understand his words. "We're here to help." A boy of about 12, slightly healthier than the others, stepped forward. "You are American?" he asked in broken English. Wilson nodded. "Yes, my name is James." The boy studied Wilson's dark skin with open curiosity. "I am David, from Warsaw." He hesitated, then asked, "The Germans say black men have tails. Is this true?" Despite everything he had seen that day, Wilson found himself laughing, a release of tension that felt almost inappropriate amidst such suffering, yet somehow necessary. "No, David, that's not true." David nodded seriously. "I did not think so. The Germans tell many lies." "Yes," Wilson agreed, "they do." Gradually, the other children emerged from their hiding places, gathering around Wilson. He distributed small portions of chocolate from his rations, following the medic's instructions to give only tiny amounts to the malnourished children. David pointed to the patch on Wilson's uniform, the distinctive Black Panther of the 761st. "What is this?" "That's our unit symbol," Wilson explained. "We're the 761st Tank Battalion. They call us the Black Panthers." David's eyes widened. "You fight in tanks? Real tanks?" Wilson nodded. "Yes. Would you like to see one?" The boy's face lit up with the first genuine childish excitement Wilson had seen in the camp. David turned and rapidly translated for the other children, who responded with a mixture of fear and interest. "It's safe," Wilson assured them, "I promise." He led the small group of children to where his Sherman tank was parked near the camp entrance. The children circled it cautiously, touching its metal sides with hesitant fingers. When Wilson climbed up and opened the commander's hatch, inviting David to look inside, the boy's face transformed with wonder. "Can I—" David began hesitantly. "Can I go inside?" Wilson lifted the small boy easily, lowering him through the hatch into the tank where Davis was organizing ammunition. "Davis, this is David. He's our guest." Davis, still shaken by what they had seen in the camp, managed a smile for the boy. "Hey there, little man, welcome aboard." For the next 20 minutes, Wilson and Davis showed David and the other children the inside of the Sherman, explaining in simple terms how it operated. The children's fear gradually gave way to curiosity and even occasional smiles. As they helped the last child down from the tank, Wilson noticed Captain Cohen watching from a short distance away. When the children had been escorted back to their barracks by a medic, Cohen approached. "That was a good thing you did, Sergeant," he said quietly. Wilson shrugged. "They're just kids. They should get to be kids, even here." Cohen nodded, his expression somber. "Especially here." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the camp settled into an uneasy evening routine, medics moving between barracks, soldiers establishing security perimeters, prisoners trying to comprehend their sudden liberation. "We found more documents," Cohen said finally, "records of what happened here, what they did to these people." Wilson turned to him. "And? It's worse than we thought. Medical experiments, mass executions, forced labor, deaths in the tens of thousands." Cohen ran a hand through his hair. "There were American POWs here too, segregated from the main camp, including some Negro soldiers." Wilson's head snapped up. "Where?" "Barracks 26. But Wilson—" Cohen hesitated. They were executed just before we arrived. All of them. Wilson felt as if he'd been struck. American soldiers, black men like himself, had been here, suffering, waiting for rescue that came too late. "I need to see," he said. Cohen nodded. "I'll take you." They walked in silence through the darkening camp to a barracks set apart from the others, surrounded by a separate fence. Inside, they found a scene that would haunt Wilson for the rest of his life. 23 bodies, all in American uniforms, laid out in a row. Each had been shot in the back of the head. Wilson moved slowly along the line, looking at each face. Black faces, like his own, now forever stilled. Dog tags had been removed, making identification difficult, but a few personal effects remained beside each body. A letter from home, a photograph, a lucky charm. Beside one body lay a worn photograph of a smiling woman holding a baby. Wilson picked it up, turning it over to find a handwritten note. "To my dearest James, come home to us soon. Love, Sarah." The man's name had been James, like his own. Wilson carefully placed the photograph on the dead soldier's chest, then straightened and saluted. Cohen, standing silently behind him, did the same. "They'll be honored properly," Cohen said as they left the barracks. "All of them," Wilson nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. That night, Wilson couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his tank, watching the floodlights the engineers had set up around the camp perimeter, and listening to the occasional cries from the prisoners' barracks, some in pain, others in nightmares, still others in long-delayed grief, now that safety allowed such emotions to surface. Davis joined him, offering a cigarette, which Wilson accepted gratefully. "Can't sleep either?" Davis asked. Wilson shook his head. "Keep seeing those men in Barracks 26, thinking it could have been us." Davis nodded. "Yeah." They smoked in silence for a while before Davis spoke again. "You know what gets me? Back home, we can't even sit at the same lunch counter as white folks. Can't use the same bathroom or drink from the same water fountain. But here we are in Germany, fighting and dying to stop this." Wilson gestured toward the camp. "This is different." "Is it?" Davis asked. "Different scale, maybe, but the thinking behind it, that some people are better than others because of who they are, how they were born, that's the same thinking that says I can't vote in Mississippi or marry a white girl in Virginia." Wilson had no answer to that. The comparison was uncomfortable, yet he couldn't entirely dismiss it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Baldwin from the 42nd Division headquarters. Despite the late hour, the Major looked alert, though the strain of the day showed in the tightness around his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Wilson?" Baldwin asked. Wilson stood, saluting. "Yes, sir." Baldwin returned the salute. "At ease. I need to speak with you about tomorrow's operations." Davis discreetly moved away, leaving Wilson alone with the Major. "Sir?" Wilson prompted. Baldwin sighed. "We're getting reports of another camp about 20 kilometers from here. Smaller than this one, but similar. It's called Allach. I'm putting together a task force to secure it tomorrow morning. I want your platoon to be part of it." Wilson nodded. "We'll be ready, sir." Baldwin hesitated, then added, "There's something else. We've had incidents with some of the prisoners here." "What kind of incidents, sir?" "Some of the liberated prisoners have attacked SS personnel we've detained, beaten them severely, in a few cases killed them." Baldwin's expression was troubled. "I understand the impulse, God knows I do, but we can't allow it." Wilson remembered the scene he had broken up earlier that day. "What do you need from us, sir?" "We need your men to help maintain order, especially around the prisoner processing areas. Some of the former inmates seem to respond better to your men than to white soldiers." Wilson understood immediately. "Because they see us as having suffered too." Baldwin nodded. "Possibly. Whatever the reason, I need your men to help keep the peace while we process both the survivors and the SS prisoners. Justice will come through proper channels." "Understood, sir. We'll do our part." After Baldwin left, Wilson found he still couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to the dead American POWs in Barracks 26 and to Davis's uncomfortable comparison between Nazi racism and American segregation. Different scales, certainly, but were the roots truly so different? The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Additional medical units had arrived overnight, along with supplies and support personnel. The task force for Allach was assembling near the main gate, with Wilson's tank platoon at its core. Before departing, Wilson sought out Otto Müller, who had emerged as a leader among the survivors, helping to organize them and communicate with American forces. "We're heading to another camp," Wilson told him. "Allach, do you know it?" Müller nodded gravely. "Yes, a satellite of Dachau. Many are sent there to work in the BMW factory nearby." "Is there anything we should know before we go?" Müller considered the question carefully. "The commandant there, Hauptsturmführer Wagner, is known for his cruelty. He takes pleasure in it." He placed a bony hand on Wilson's arm. "Be careful, my friend." Wilson nodded. "We will. And Müller, thank you for helping us yesterday with the children and the food distribution." The elderly man smiled sadly. "After 4 years here, to be treated as a human again. That is thanks enough." The drive to Allach took less than an hour. Unlike the main Dachau complex, this satellite camp was smaller and less heavily defended. As Wilson's tanks approached, supported by a company of infantry from the 42nd Division, they encountered only token resistance from a handful of SS guards, most of whom quickly surrendered. What they found inside mirrored the horrors of Dachau itself: overcrowded barracks, emaciated prisoners, and evidence of systematic abuse. But there was one key difference: the proximity of the BMW factory, where many of the prisoners had been forced to work manufacturing airplane engines for the Luftwaffe. As Wilson's men helped secure the camp and establish medical aid stations, he accompanied Captain Cohen and a squad of infantry to inspect the factory, which had been abandoned by its German supervisors just hours earlier. The factory floor was vast, filled with machinery and partially assembled aircraft engines. Evidence of the prisoners' work was everywhere: tools left mid-task, components on assembly lines, production schedules on chalkboards. But it was the conditions that struck Wilson most forcefully: no safety equipment, no ventilation despite the toxic chemicals, bloodstains on workbenches where exhausted or malnourished workers had collapsed. "They worked them until they died," Cohen said quietly, "then replaced them with new arrivals." Among the office spaces, they discovered detailed records: production quotas, prisoner assignments, even efficiency ratings for different groups of workers. Cohen, examining the documents with the help of a German-speaking corporal, looked up with disgust. "They rated the Jewish workers lowest in efficiency," he said, "but the records show they were given half the rations of other workers and assigned the most dangerous tasks." Wilson nodded grimly. Rigged game. Their inspection was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Jackson, who had been overseeing the securing of the camp itself. "Sir," Jackson addressed Cohen, "we found him. Hauptsturmführer Wagner. He was hiding in a false wall in the camp administration building. When they returned to the camp, they found Wagner being held under guard in what had been his office. Unlike Schmidt at Dachau, who had maintained an air of arrogant composure, Wagner was visibly terrified, his uniform stained with sweat, his eyes darting frantically between his captors. When Wilson entered behind Cohen, Wagner's gaze fixed on him, and his expression changed from fear to contempt. "You send a Negro to interrogate me?" Wagner asked in accented English. "How appropriate that America's mongrel army employs its mongrel races." Cohen's voice was cold. "Staff Sergeant Wilson is a decorated combat veteran who has destroyed 7 German tanks. You would do well to show respect," Wagner scoffed. "Respect? For an Untermensch? Next, you'll ask me to respect the Jews and Gypsies." Wilson stepped forward, his imposing physical presence causing Wagner to shrink back despite himself. "Those Untermenschen are human beings who survived despite everything you did to them. They've shown more courage and dignity than you ever will." Wagner's face flushed with anger. "You know nothing. I was following orders, maintaining discipline. These people, they are criminals, saboteurs." "Children?" Wilson asked quietly. "Were the children saboteurs too?" Wagner had no answer for that. His gaze dropped to the floor. As they left the office, leaving Wagner under guard to await formal processing, Cohen turned to Wilson. "How do you maintain such control? If it were me—" Wilson shook his head. "Believe me, I wanted to do more than talk to him, but then I'd be no better." Throughout the day, As they processed the survivors of Alak and prepared them for evacuation to medical facilities, Wilson found himself thinking about that exchange, about the nature of hatred and how it corrupted both the hated and the hater, about how easy it would be to respond to contempt with contempt, to cruelty with cruelty. By evening, the situation at Alak was stabilizing. Medical teams had identified the most critical cases for immediate evacuation. Food and water had been distributed. The few remaining SS guards had been secured and separated from the camp population to prevent reprisals. Wilson, exhausted after 2 days of bearing witness to human depravity on an industrial scale, sat alone on a stack of empty ration crates, writing in his journal. He had kept this journal since basic training, recording his experiences as a black soldier in a segregated army, fighting for a country that often didn't recognize his full humanity. Today's entry was different, harder to write. How did one find words for Dachau, for Alak? How did one process the systematic murder of millions based solely on who they were? Davis found him there, sitting quietly beside him for a moment before speaking. Mail came in with the supply trucks. Got a letter from my girl in Harlem. He pulled out a well-worn photograph of a beautiful young woman with a bright smile. Ella. We're getting married when I get home. Wilson smiled, grateful for this moment of normalcy. She's beautiful, Davis. Yeah, she is. Davis carefully returned the photo to his pocket. Sarge, can I ask you something? Sure. What happens after? I mean, after we go home? After seeing all this? Wilson considered the question. I don't know. I don't think anyone can know until they're there. Davis nodded. My daddy fought in the last war, came back different, Mama said. Couldn't talk about what he saw in France. He paused. I'm not sure I'll be able to talk about this either. Wilson placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. You don't have to figure it out now. Just know you won't be alone in trying. The next morning, Wilson's platoon was ordered back to Dachau to rejoin the main battalion. As they prepared to depart Alak, a group of former prisoners gathered to see them off. Despite their physical weakness, many insisted on standing to attention as the American soldiers loaded their vehicles. One man, a former Polish cavalry officer who had been imprisoned for leading resistance operations against the German occupation, approached Wilson and saluted with military precision. Wilson returned the salute. We will not forget, the Polish officer said simply. When others said it was impossible to defeat the Germans, you proved them wrong. When they said that men with dark skin could not fight as well as others, you proved them wrong. We will tell this story. Wilson, deeply moved, could only nod his thanks. As the tank column rumbled away from Alak, Wilson stood in the commander's hatch of his Sherman, watching the shrinking figures of the liberated prisoners. Some waved, others simply stood watching, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and the lingering shock of their ordeal. Upon returning to Dachau, Wilson found the situation there had evolved significantly. Additional medical units had arrived, along with military government teams to begin the massive task of documenting the camp, identifying survivors, and processing evidence for future war crimes trials. Colonel Bates summoned Wilson to a meeting with officers from the 42nd and 45th Divisions. In the commandeered SS officers' mess, now serving as a command post, Wilson found Major Baldwin, Captain Cohen, and several other officers gathered around a map table. Staff Sergeant Wilson reporting as ordered, sir, Wilson said, saluting. Bates returned the salute. At ease, Wilson. We're discussing next steps for Dachau and Alak. Major Baldwin has requested that elements of the 761st remain here, while the bulk of our combat forces continue the advance toward Munich and the Alpine regions. Baldwin nodded. Your men have established good rapport with the survivors, Sergeant, and frankly, we need experienced combat troops to maintain security as we process both the survivors and the SS personnel we've detained. Wilson understood the subtext. The 761st, black soldiers, were being asked to stay behind while white combat units continued the advance. In normal circumstances, this might have seemed like another example of black soldiers being denied the opportunity to participate in high-profile operations. But here now, he recognized that the task they were being asked to perform was equally vital. How many of my men will you need, sir? Wilson asked. Your entire platoon if Colonel Bates can spare them, Baldwin replied. We anticipate it will take at least 2 weeks to evacuate all the survivors and fully document the camp. Bates looked to Wilson. Your thoughts, Sergeant? Wilson was momentarily surprised to be consulted. Sir, I believe we can be of service here. My men have developed relationships with many of the survivors, which helps with the relief efforts. He paused. And to be honest, sir, I think it's important that the world sees that Black American soldiers were part of liberating these camps. Bates nodded. I agree. Your platoon will remain attached to the 42nd Division for the duration of this operation. The rest of the battalion will continue with the 3rd Army's advance. Over the next 2 weeks, Wilson and his men worked alongside medical teams, military government officials, war correspondents, and the survivors themselves to bring order to the chaos of liberation. Each day brought new challenges, outbreaks of disease among weakened survivors, occasional violent incidents between former prisoners and captured guards, the logistical complexities of feeding and caring for thousands of displaced persons. Throughout this period, Wilson kept detailed notes in his journal, determined that what he witnessed would not be forgotten. He recorded conversations with survivors, documented evidence of Nazi crimes, and reflected on the implications of what he was seeing for his own country's racial struggles. On May 3rd, 5 days after the liberation of Dachau, Wilson was present when a delegation of prominent American officials arrived to witness firsthand the conditions in the camp. Among them was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, accompanied by Generals George S. Patton and Omar Bradley. Wilson stood at attention as the generals toured the camp, their expressions growing increasingly grim as they viewed the crematorium, the medical experimentation rooms, the mass graves still being exhumed by engineering units. When the tour reached the area where Wilson's men were overseeing food distribution, General Patton, known for his hard-driving leadership and complicated racial views, paused to observe. "These are your men, Colonel?" Patton asked Bates, who was accompanying the delegation. "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Wilson's platoon from the 761st. Patton studied the black soldiers working efficiently alongside the camp survivors, many of whom now recognized individual soldiers by name and greeted them with genuine warmth despite the language barriers. Good work, Sergeant," Patton said simply as he passed Wilson. "Thank you, sir," Wilson replied, maintaining his military bearing despite his surprise at the acknowledgement. Later that day, as journalists documented the camp for newspapers and newsreels back home, a reporter from the Pittsburgh Courier, one of America's leading black newspapers, approached Wilson. "Sergeant Wilson, I'm Howard Mitchell from the Courier. I'd like to talk to you about the 761st's role in liberating Dachau." Wilson hesitated, aware that military regulations required press interviews to be approved through proper channels. But this was different, a chance to ensure that the contribution of black soldiers was properly recorded. "Let me check with my CO," Wilson replied. To his surprise, Colonel Bates readily approved the interview. "The world needs to know what happened here," Bates said, "and they need to know who helped end it." For the next hour, Wilson walked Mitchell through the camp, describing the liberation operation and the subsequent relief efforts. He introduced the reporter to Davis, Jackson, and other men of his platoon, each of whom shared their experiences. "What strikes me," Mitchell said as they stood overlooking the main compound, "is the irony of black American soldiers liberating victims of racial persecution when America itself practices segregation." Wilson chose his words carefully. "We're fighting for America's stated ideals, not its current reality. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. That's the America we're fighting for, even if we haven't fully achieved it yet." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "And has this experience, seeing where racial hatred can ultimately lead, changed your perspective?" Wilson gazed across the camp, where his men were working alongside survivors who just days earlier had been facing death. "It's reinforced what I already believed, that judging people based on who they are rather than what they do is not just wrong, it's dangerous. What happened here started with words, with the idea that some people are less human than others. We can't allow that thinking anywhere, including back home." As the cleanup and documentation of Dachau continued, Wilson developed a particularly close relationship with Otto Müller, the elderly Jehovah's Witness, who had been imprisoned for refusing to support Nazi ideology. Despite his frail physical condition, Müller worked tirelessly to help organize the survivor community, maintain calm and assist American authorities with identification and documentation. One evening, Wilson found Müller sitting alone outside the barracks that now housed camp survivors awaiting evacuation. The old man was writing in a small notebook, his handwriting precise despite his weakened state. "May I join you?" Wilson asked. Müller looked up with a smile. "Of course, my friend. Please." Wilson sat beside him on the wooden bench. "What are you writing?" "Names," Müller replied. "As many as I can remember. People who did not survive. Someone must remember them." Wilson nodded, understanding all too well the importance of bearing witness. "How many?" "From my barracks alone? Over 2,000 in 4 years." Müller closed the notebook gently. "Each was a person with hopes, dreams, a family. Each deserves to be remembered." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Müller spoke again. "Tomorrow I leave for a displaced persons camp near Munich. Before I go, I wanted to thank you." "I was just doing my job," Wilson said. Müller shook his head. "No, it was more than that. When you stopped the prisoners from attacking that guard, when you said we are not them, you reminded us of our humanity when we were in danger of losing it." Wilson was humbled by the old man's words. "I've been thinking about that moment, about how fine the line is between justice and revenge." "Yes," Müller agreed. "It is a line we must all watch carefully." He studied Wilson thoughtfully. "May I ask you something personal?" "Of course. In your country, I understand that people with dark skin are treated differently, separated, denied opportunities. How do you fight for a nation that does not fully accept you?" It was a question Wilson had asked himself many times, especially since arriving at Dachau. "I fight for what America could be, should be, for its promise, not its present." He paused. "And I believe that what we've done here, what we've seen here, will help change things back home. How can America claim to fight against Nazi racism while maintaining its own?" Müller nodded slowly. "Perhaps this terrible war will bring change for both our countries." "I hope so," Wilson replied. "I truly do." The next morning, as Müller prepared to depart with a group of survivors bound for the displaced persons camp, he pressed a small object into Wilson's hand, a carved wooden panther, rough but recognizable. "One of the Polish prisoners made this," Müller explained, "to remember the Black Panthers who saved us." Wilson was deeply moved by the gesture. "Thank you. I'll keep it always." As the trucks carrying Müller and the other survivors pulled away, Davis approached, watching them go. "Think we'll ever know what happened to them after they leave here?" Wilson tucked the wooden panther carefully into his pocket. "I hope so. I plan to find out." By mid-May, the war in Europe had ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. The 761st Battalion, minus Wilson's platoon, had continued its advance through southern Germany, adding to its distinguished combat record. Wilson and his men remained at Dachau until the last survivors had been evacuated and the camp secured for eventual use as evidence in war crimes trials. On their final day at Dachau, Wilson gathered his men near their tanks. The camp that had been chaotic and overcrowded upon their arrival now stood empty, its buildings silent testimonies to what had occurred there. "Before we move out," Wilson said, "I want to thank each of you for what you've done here. It wasn't the kind of combat mission we trained for, but it may be the most important work we'll ever do." The men nodded solemnly, each carrying his own memories of what they had witnessed and the small ways they had helped bring dignity back to those who had been systematically dehumanized. "When we go home," Wilson continued, "people will ask us what we did in the war. Tell them about our tank battles in France and Germany. Tell them about crossing the Rhine. But make sure you tell them about this place too. Make sure they know what happened here and why it can never happen again." As they prepared to depart, Captain Cohen arrived to bid them farewell. His wounded shoulder had healed, leaving him with a slight stiffness, but otherwise fully recovered. "Sergeant Wilson," Cohen said, extending his hand. I wanted to thank you and your men personally before you rejoin your battalion. Wilson shook the offered hand firmly. It's been an honor serving with you, sir. Cohen nodded toward the camp. We've documented everything, taken thousands of photographs, recorded survivor testimonies. The world will know what happened here. Will they understand it? Wilson asked. Cohen sighed. I don't know if anyone can truly understand who wasn't here, but they'll know the facts, at least. As Wilson's platoon departed Dachau for the last time, joining a convoy bound for the 761st's new position near Munich, he found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him, a black man from rural Georgia, to this pivotal moment in history. How would this experience change him? How would it change America? The reunion with the rest of the 761st was emotional. The battalion had continued fighting through the war's final days, adding to its already impressive record. When Wilson's platoon arrived at the battalion's bivouac area on the outskirts of Munich, they were greeted with cheers and embraces from comrades who had heard about their role in liberating Dachau. Colonel Bates addressed the entire battalion that evening. Men, with Germany's surrender, our combat mission in Europe is complete. The 761st Tank Battalion has fought in France, Belgium, Germany, and Austria. You've destroyed 41 enemy tanks, 61 pillboxes, and over 400 machine gun nests. You've captured over 400 prisoners. The men cheered, proud of their accomplishments despite the obstacles they had faced as a segregated unit. But beyond these statistics, Bates continued, you've done something else. You've proven beyond any doubt the courage and capability of black soldiers, and for those of you who served at Dachau and Allach, you've helped expose and document one of the greatest crimes in human history. In the days that followed, as the battalion settled into occupation duties, Wilson wrote a detailed account of his experiences at Dachau for inclusion in the unit's official records. He wanted to ensure that the role of the 761st in liberating the camp would not be forgotten or minimized in the official histories of the war. One evening, as Wilson sat writing outside his tent, he was surprised by a visit from Major Baldwin of the 42nd Division, now serving with the military government authorities in Munich. Sergeant Wilson, Baldwin greeted him. Got a minute? Of course, sir, Wilson replied, setting aside his writing. Baldwin sat on an ammunition crate opposite Wilson. I wanted to update you on a few things from Dachau. First, Schmidt and Wagner are both being held for the war crimes trials. The evidence we gathered, including your testimony, will be crucial in their prosecution. Wilson nodded. Good. Second, we've made progress identifying the American POWs who were executed at Barracks 26. Their remains are being prepared for proper burial with military honors. Baldwin hesitated. And there's something else, a request actually. Sir, the War Department is sending a documentary film crew to record conditions at the camps for historical purposes and for possible use in war crimes trials. They specifically requested that some of the liberating troops be included in the filming. Baldwin met Wilson's gaze directly. They asked for you and your men by name, the Black Panthers who freed Dachau. Wilson was taken aback. How did they know about us? Baldwin smiled slightly. That article in the Pittsburgh Courier made quite an impact. It's been reprinted in papers across the country. People are talking about the 761st and what you found at Dachau. The filming took place the following week. Wilson and 5 of his men, including Davis, returned to Dachau with the film crew. The camp had been partially cleaned up, but remained largely as they had found it. The army had decided to preserve it as evidence. As cameras rolled, Wilson walked through the camp, describing what they had encountered upon arrival, the condition of the prisoners, the evidence of systematic murder they had discovered. He spoke of the American POWs executed just before liberation and of the relationships his men had formed with survivors. The director, a civilian contractor named Edward Williams, seemed particularly interested in the perspective of black American soldiers liberating victims of racial persecution. Was there a sense of connection between your experience as black Americans and what you found here? Williams asked. Wilson considered the question carefully. There's no comparison in scale or severity. What happened here was industrialized murder on a scale that's hard to comprehend. But yes, there was a recognition. We understood something about being judged for who you are rather than what you do. And some of the survivors seemed to sense that connection too. Williams nodded. And has this experience affected how you view America's racial situation? It's clarified things, Wilson replied. Seeing where racial hatred can ultimately lead has made me more determined to fight against it in any form, including back home. If America stands against what happened here, and we do, then we have to look at our own practices too. After the filming concluded, Wilson took a moment alone in what had been the camp's assembly area, the place where prisoners had been forced to stand for hours during roll call, regardless of weather conditions, where public punishments had been carried out, where the weak had often collapsed never to rise again. He thought about Otto Miller and David, about the American POWs in Barracks 26, about the thousands who had died at Dachau before liberation could reach them. He thought about his own journey, from Georgia sharecropper to tank commander to witness of both humanity's darkest potential and its capacity for resilience. As summer turned to fall, the 761st remained in Germany on occupation duty. The war with Japan ended in August, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing World War II to its final conclusion. Thoughts throughout the battalion turned increasingly toward home. In October, nearly a year after they had first landed in France, the men of the 761st received orders to prepare for return to the United States. As they packed equipment and prepared vehicles for transport, the mood was a mixture of joy at the prospect of going home and uncertainty about what awaited them there. For Wilson, now promoted to technical sergeant for his service at Dachau, the impending return brought complicated emotions. He had led men in combat across Europe, helped liberate one of history's most notorious concentration camps, and been recognized for his service by generals and war correspondents. Yet he knew that in many parts of America, he would still be expected to step off the sidewalk for white pedestrians, use segregated facilities, and accept second-class citizenship. The night before their departure from Germany, Colonel Bates held a final formation of the entire battalion. The men stood at attention as Bates addressed them one last time on European soil. "Men of the 761st," Bates began, "tomorrow we begin our journey home. You return to America as heroes, having proven yourselves in the crucible of combat. Your record speaks for itself. 183 days of continuous combat, penetration of 4 German defensive lines, participation in the capture of over 30 major towns." He paused, looking out over the assembled soldiers, black men who had overcome prejudice and skepticism to become one of the most effective tank battalions in the European theater. "But beyond these achievements, some of you bear witness to something else, the liberation of Dachau and Allach. You've seen firsthand where racial hatred ultimately leads when unchecked. You've helped document crimes that must never be forgotten or repeated." Bates's voice grew more personal. "It has been the greatest honor of my career to command this battalion. When you return home, you'll face challenges different from those you've overcome here. But remember this, what you've accomplished cannot be denied or diminished. You've not only served your country, you've helped change the course of history." The battalion's return to the United States was marked with little fanfare. Despite their distinguished service record, the 761st received no ticker-tape parade, no public recognition comparable to that accorded to many white units. They arrived at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, in November 1945, processed through demobilization procedures, and prepared to return to civilian life in a still segregated America. Before they dispersed to their homes across the country, Wilson gathered his former platoon members one last time. They met in a segregated USO club near the base, away from the restrictions of military protocol. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," Wilson told them, "and to thank you for everything you did, not just in combat, but at Dachau and Allach." Davis, soon to return to Harlem and his waiting fiancée, raised his glass. "To the Black Panthers." The others joined the toast, their faces reflecting the bond formed through shared experience, both the terror of combat and the moral clarity of their role in liberating the concentration camps. "What happens now?" asked Corporal Johnson, who was returning to Chicago. "After everything we've seen, everything we've done, how do we just go back to the way things were?" Wilson shook his head. "We don't. We can't. What we saw at Dachau, It changes you. And what we do with that change is up to us. Lieutenant Jackson, who had plans to use the GI Bill to attend college, nodded thoughtfully. We bring it home. We tell the truth about what we saw. And we use it to push for change. Exactly, Wilson agreed. We fought fascism over there. Now we fight injustice here, not with tanks and guns, but with truth and determination. As they parted, each man promised to stay in touch, to share news of their lives after the war, to remember both what they had accomplished and what they had witnessed. Wilson returned to Georgia briefly to visit family, but found he could no longer accept the rigid segregation of the Deep South. Using his veterans' benefits, he moved to Detroit, where he found work in an automobile factory and joined the growing civil rights movement. In the years that followed, Wilson remained in contact with several key figures from his wartime experience. He exchanged letters with Otto Müller, who had returned to Berlin to help rebuild a democratic Germany. He corresponded with Captain Cohen, who had become a prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and he maintained close friendships with many of his former platoon members, especially Davis, who had married his sweetheart Ella and was working as a postal clerk in New York. In 1948, when President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces, Wilson felt a sense of validation. The service of units like the 761st had helped demonstrate the absurdity of military segregation, contributing to this historic step forward. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Wilson became increasingly involved in activism. He spoke at community meetings and church gatherings, sharing his experiences at Dachau and drawing parallels to the ongoing struggle for equality in America. "What I saw at Dachau," he would tell audiences, "was the ultimate end of the road that begins with seeing some people as less human than others. We fought against that evil overseas. We must fight its echoes here at home." In 1963, Wilson traveled to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. As he stood before the Lincoln Memorial listening to Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, he thought about his journey from tank commander to civil rights advocate, about the connections between his war against fascism abroad and his struggle for equality at home. That evening, at a gathering of veterans who had participated in the march, Wilson reconnected with Davis, now a postal supervisor and local NAACP leader in Harlem. They hadn't seen each other in several years, though they had maintained their correspondence. "Ever think about Dachau?" Davis asked as they shared a quiet moment away from the crowd. "Every day," Wilson replied honestly. "Some things you never forget." Davis nodded. "Me too. But you know what stays with me most? Not the horrors, though God knows those are burned into my memory. It's what you said that day, when the prisoners were attacking that guard. We are not them." That's what this movement is about too, isn't it? Fighting injustice without becoming unjust ourselves. Wilson smiled at his former loader, now a mature man with grey beginning to streak his temples. That's exactly right. The moral victory matters as much as the political one. In 1965, Wilson received an unexpected letter from Germany. It was from David, the young boy he had allowed to explore his tank at Dachau. Now a young man of 32, David had tracked Wilson down through veterans organizations. He was working as a teacher in Munich, married with 2 children of his own. "I never forgot the American tank soldier who showed kindness to a frightened boy," David wrote. "You gave me my first moment of childhood joy after years of horror. I have told my own children about you and the Black Panthers who freed us when others said it could not be done." The letter brought tears to Wilson's eyes, evidence that even small acts of humanity could resonate across decades and continents. In the autumn of 1968, as the civil rights movement achieved landmark legislation but still faced significant challenges, Wilson was invited to speak at a Holocaust remembrance event in Detroit. The invitation came from a survivor group that included several former Dachau prisoners who had settled in the United States after the war. Standing before the audience, Wilson spoke from the heart about his experiences. "When we entered Dachau on April 29, 1945, we encountered evil in its purest form. Not chaotic evil, but methodical, organized, bureaucratic evil. We saw what happens when a society decides that some lives matter less than others, that some people are not fully human. He paused, looking out at the faces before him, Holocaust survivors and their families, fellow veterans, community members of various backgrounds. As a Black American soldier, I brought my own experiences of discrimination to that moment. Nothing comparable to what the prisoners had endured, but enough to recognize the dangerous path that begins with categorizing humans as other. What I learned at Dachau strengthened my resolve to fight for a more just society here at home. After the event, an elderly man approached Wilson, extending a trembling hand. "You may not remember me," he said, "but I was at Dachau when you arrived. I remember the black soldiers who came with tanks and gave us chocolate and showed such kindness." Wilson shook the man's hand warmly, moved by this unexpected connection to his past. "I remember all of you," he replied, "every day of my life." In the decades that followed, Wilson continued his dual mission of bearing witness to the Holocaust and advocating for civil rights. He spoke to school groups, community organizations, and veterans associations, ensuring that both the horrors of Dachau and the contribution of black soldiers to its liberation remained part of the historical record. When the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in Washington, D.C. in 1993, Wilson was invited to participate in the opening ceremonies. Now 74 years old, with grandchildren of his own, he stood proudly as the role of the 761st Tank Battalion in liberating Dachau was officially acknowledged. After the ceremony, a museum historian interviewed Wilson for the oral history collection. Looking back after all these years, the historian asked, "How do you think your experience at Dachau influenced your life?" Wilson thought carefully before responding. "It gave me perspective. After seeing what human beings suffered there and what human beings were capable of inflicting, the everyday indignities of American segregation seemed both more bearable and more obviously wrong. Bearable because they paled beside the gas chambers and crematoria, wrong because they sprang from the same poisoned root of seeing some people as less than fully human." He paused, fingering the small wooden panther that he still carried in his pocket after all these years, Otto Müller's parting gift. "But most importantly, it gave me purpose. When the Germans at Dachau mocked us as colored troops, they thought they were highlighting our inferiority. Instead, they were underlining the absurdity of their own ideology. We didn't make them pay through vengeance, as your title suggests. We made them pay by proving them wrong, about us, about the Jews and others they persecuted, about the very concept of racial superiority." Wilson looked directly at the historian, his gaze still sharp despite his advanced years. The Black Panthers of the 761st helped defeat Nazism on the battlefield. But our greater victory was moral. We liberated Dachau without becoming what we were fighting against. We remained human in the face of inhumanity. That's the legacy I'm most proud of. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.